Now, population issues and immigration have been touched on in this election campaign, perhaps not as dominant as some people might have thought. Certainly, though, there's been a lot of focus on infrastructure and helping our cities deal with growing populations. Another aspect that's critical about this election is the state of Victoria. It seems to be the state where Labor is banking on the greatest gains, where indeed the coalition could lose the election. So who better to speak to tonight as we kick off the last week of the federal election campaign than the Minister for Cities, Urban Development and Population, Alan Tudge, who also happens to be a Victorian MP. I caught up with him just a short time ago. Alan Tudge, thanks for joining us. I want to come to some population issues a little later in the interview, but first up, this announcement today from Scott Morrison, $4 billion to the Victorian State Labor Government for a project they don't want to build, for a project that they've already spent $1 billion to not build.
Well, Chris, we understand that they don't want to put money towards this project, and so what we have said today is that we will fund the entire government share of the project in order to get the job done. So the state government doesn't have to put in a cent. All they have to do is green light it, and then we will pay for the public contribution, and of course there'll be a private contribution as well. This is a critical piece of infrastructure for Victoria. I mean, Infrastructure Australia still has it on their priority list, Infrastructure Victoria still has it on their priority list, and the 100,000 commuters who take the Eastern Freeway every single day know how desperately important this piece of work is. So we want to get the job done and have the money on the table to do so.
This is a big announcement for Victoria, made in Victoria. The campaign launched from Scott Morrison today in Victoria. Obviously, your state is going to be absolutely crucial to this federal election result. Is this an attempt just to try and swing a few more seats the coalition's way, to hold on to a few more seats?
Oh, well, Chris, this has been a priority of ours for 6 years now. We took this to the 2013 election and then to the 2016 election. In both of those cases, we put $3 billion on the table for both parts of East West Link. Now we're putting $4 billion on the table to fully complete and fund the public components of just the eastern section, because the western section's already been done effectively through the Western Distributor project. So this is desperately needed, this project. It would have been completed by now, or this year it was due to be completed, had Daniel Andrews not cancelled it, and we're giving him another chance. Just get on with the job. You don't have to put a cent in. Let us pay for the government component of it so that we can join up the last freeway in Melbourne, which comes to a full stop, and connect it across to the other freeways on the other side of town.
Well, Bill Shorten, of course, is a Victorian who launched his campaign last week in Queensland, which is seen as his weakest state. Scott Morrison, a New South Welshman, launching his campaign in Victoria because that's seen as his weakest state. How do you think that the launch went today, and what do you think is the problem with Scott Morrison and Victorians?
I don't think there's any problem with Scott Morrison and Victorians. In fact, I think that they like him a lot. And despite Bill Shorten being a Victorian, I know that he's not popular. And you won't find a single poster of Bill Shorten anywhere in Victoria. I certainly haven't seen one anyway.
There's none out in the east. Peter Dutton, I'm told.
Yeah, they've put a few up of those. And the Victoria is difficult in part because the redistribution has meant that one of our seats is now we're starting off from a negative position. Of course, we had Julia Banks defect from one of the other seats, and so that's made it more difficult. But we're still very confident here in this state, and we also think that we can pick up Indi, which is up around the Wangaratta and Wodonga region, and we're also eyeing off a number of other seats around the country also.
The point is that redistribution has really put two coalition-held seats into the Labor side of the ledger, and you've got other seats that look like they could fall. I mean, it really could be Victoria that turfs the coalition out of government come Saturday night.
Well, I hope that's not the case, and we're certainly putting up very strong fights in every single one of our seats. And, we're we're still confident, but we're taking nothing for granted, and we'll be fighting absolutely every single day right up until next Saturday, Chris. And as I said, I think we can win Indi. I think that we've still got a shot also in the seat of Macnamara, formerly known as Melbourne Ports, and we have to defend our other seats as well.
Tell me about this housing policy, first homeowners policy that Scott Morrison unveiled today. It sounds like the sort of policy that Labor would be proud of. In fact, they've decided now, already announced this afternoon, that they will match it. Having the government come in really and effectively underwriting first home owners to first home buyers to get in and get a deposit, get a loan without a large deposit. It's a deliberate market intervention for first home buyers, and this is from a government with presiding over the record low interest rates and telling us that housing affordability hasn't been such a big problem, especially with housing prices going down over the past 12 months.
Well, at the same time, Chris, we still know that often the greatest impediment to a young person or a young couple buying their first home is not the repayments as such, but getting together their deposit. And if you need to get, say, a 20% deposit, plus you're paying stamp duty on top of that and your legal fees, and it can be very difficult to get that together. So what we've said here is that you'll only require a 5% deposit, and then for the other 15%, effectively we'll be guaranteeing that component of it. You'll still need to satisfy the test that you can repay it, and the banks will do that. But it'll avoid you having to pay, for example, mortgage insurance or other types of insurance, because the government will guarantee that other 15%, and that'll just make it easier for you to get into the market.
What's the cost to government of this?
I don't have that figure on me, Chris, but I'm happy to get it for you.
All right, let's move to your area of population. You look after that area as well. There are claims that Labor's plans to allow these extra visas, uncapped, to bring parents into the country could see as many as 200,000 applications. So what will that do for population projections and immigration targets?
So they've got a very different position than us in relation to immigration numbers and population growth numbers. We've been concerned that our population has been growing very fast, and particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, which have been really growing fast and where the infrastructure hasn't always been keeping up. And so our policy is actually to reduce the population pressures on Melbourne and Sydney particularly by cutting the migration rate and also encouraging more new migrants to settle in the smaller cities and in the regions. Whereas the Labor Party, with this policy, will actually see an increase in the migration intake coming through because it's an uncapped policy. There's about 100,000 people already waiting to get those visas, and so you could see an extra 100,000 in year one, let alone what might come in the future. So that's going to be a fundamental difference between the Labor Party and us.
What's your cap on these parent visas at the moment?
Yeah, so we've got a 15,000 cap on that, and that just went through the Parliament last year. And we think that's reasonable and measured because it's a 10-year visa that you're getting. It's a parental-sponsored visa, and largely for people whose parents are overseas and they want to get them into the country and stay for more than just the length of a tourist visa. So we offer them a 10-year visa. You have to pay a bit of money to get that. 15,000 per annum. Labor is effectively uncapping that. So you can imagine how many people will take advantage of that and in essence come here for 10 years. And that may mean an extra 100,000 come in year one on top of the 160,000 permanent migration cap that we already have presently.
What's the cost of this to taxpayers? For instance, do these parents have full rights to Medicare and pension entitlements?
They don't. They'll be required to have private health insurance. They won't be able to access things like welfare. So similar in some respects to a tourist visa like that. But of course, emergencies can happen. Someone might drop out of their private health insurance. And so there are still costs associated with a parental visa, even though they have the private health insurance and can't access welfare. So there is an additional cost associated if you do blow out in those numbers.
All right, so that's a bit of a policy difference there on population. Population,
yeah, and it's also the other
as an election campaign issue, which is surprising, because if you do any surveys about what people are worried about, especially as you say in Melbourne, Sydney, and perhaps southeast Queensland, population growth is an issue of a high degree of concern to a lot of voters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the congestion pressures, particularly in Melbourne, Sydney and to some extent in southeast Queensland, are very real, and our population plan is to ease up the population growth on those cities, encourage more new people into the country to go to those smaller regions, to go to the regions in some of the smaller cities, and massively invest in congestion-busting infrastructure at the same time. And as I said, the Labor Party is going in a different direction. They'll have an increase in population coming in through this parental visa. Plus, they're also increasing the refugee intake as well from what we have as 18,750 up to 32,000 per annum as well. So on both counts, they'll be increasing the population pressures on Melbourne and Sydney, because nearly all those people will come into Melbourne and Sydney. Whereas we're trying to ease the pressures on those big capitals.
Bill Shorten seems to think that News Corp newspapers are campaigning against him because they ran the extra information, or at least a couple of them ran extra information about his mother's career last week. What do you think of this paranoia, this claim of a News Corp conspiracy in favour of the coalition, presumably, but certainly against Labor?
Chris, I think you're on a hiding to nothing if a politician complains about the media, because the media is like, for us, it's like the weather. You can't have much influence over it. I did note, though, that while, yes, the Daily Telegraph ran that story, and I didn't particularly like that story, there were other News Limited papers that didn't run that story. So it's not exactly a conspiracy as such if some papers aren't running it and other papers are. It's more just the editorial decision from each of the editors of each of the major papers as to which stories they do run, and they differ. They didn't run it in the Herald Sun.
What about the media behemoth that taxpayers have a direct interest in, and that is the public broadcasters, $1.5 billion of annual funding? Do you think the ABC has been a fair and honest broker throughout this campaign, or do you think Labor gets a pretty soft treatment, especially from the national broadcaster?
Chris, again, I don't think that me making commentary about the media is really worthwhile.
It's good, clean fun, though.
The media does what they're going to do. We have to do what we're going to do, and whether we like it or not, they do their job and we do our job.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that the alternative Prime Minister, Bill Shorten, is lashing out at one of the largest media companies in the country.
And that's up to him to make those comments. From my perspective, I'm doing my job prosecuting our case in relation to our infrastructure agenda, our population plans, and I'll let the media do their job.
OK, so you start the final week of the campaign behind. Do you believe that the coalition can somehow find a way in this final week to get ahead, to hang on to government?
Oh, absolutely. So we are still confident that we can win this thing, and I've identified a couple of seats here in Victoria that we think we can pick up. But there's other seats also in other states that we've got our eye on to pick up, and then we're defending well the seats that we do hold. But, you know, it's going to come down to the wire, I think, and but Scott Morrison is doing such a great job. He's got such a clear plan for the economy to keep it strong, whereas Bill Shorten has got $387 billion of new taxes, and that's going to have a real wrecking ball impact on the economy. And I think the differences are stark, and I think the Australian public will see those differences and back Scott Morrison to remain Prime Minister.
Alan Tudge, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Alan Tudge there, taking the orthodox position of not wanting to get into a debate about media bias. It's always good, clean fun, as I said. I enjoy a discussion about these things. Interestingly, though, Alan Tudge said that it's no good complaining about the media. It's like complaining about the weather because you can't change it. Well, there is one party in this election campaign, and it's the same party that's complaining about the media. It is a party that says it can change the weather. So go figure.